You want the cup?
Tea, tea, tea.
You're drinking all my juice.
Oh, tea, cup.
Okay.
Cup.
No. Julie, eat some food. Eat some food, Sweet Pea. Julia, you gotta eat some food. No, you can't just drink out of the cup, sweetie. You gotta eat some food. Oh, sweetie. Sweetie.